Welcome to this presentation of food production, consumption, and resistance among Japanese Americans incarcerated by the US government during World War II. I'm Paula Fujiwara, a sensei who grew up in Sacramento, California, among an extended family and community of Japanese Americans. My grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, and friends were incarcerated between 1942 and 1946 in the United States government-sanctioned War Relocation Authority camps, primarily in Tule Lake, but also in Jerome, Rohrer, Gila River, and Amachi. The idea for this talk is based on the broad theme of food and power at the 2019 Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery in Oxford, England. Food sustains us in many ways. Its production requires months of planning, nurturing, and even anxiety as farmers watch the weather, which is the one variable that nature controls. Food is also fuel for the body and is a source of memories, both good and bad. During the incarceration of Japanese Americans, it also became a tool of resistance. As such, in this presentation, I will concentrate on the power dynamics of three intertwined food-related themes. First, that between the inmates of the War Relocation Authority camps in charge of incarcerating the Japanese Americans. Second, the breakdown of the family structure. And third, the tension among the pro-American Japanese and those whose upbringing favored a more Japanese consensus style of interaction. The research and interviews I performed for this paper highlighted and deepened my understanding of the trauma of these years on the Japanese American psyche and some of my family's culinary origin story, which is similar to many other incarcerees and includes Spam, corned beef hash, and shoyu weenies. Although this is about the dynamics of food production and consumption in the camps, I hope I can convey to you some of the context that predated the incarceration regarding this shameful era in American history. I will be using the now accepted wording of detention centers and concentration camps, incarceration camps, rather than the euphemistic assembly centers and internment or relocation camps, in line with the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund. This is in no way meant to undermine the experience of the Holocaust survivors and their families. For those of you who are new to the topic of this presentation, I want to define three terms that I'll be using. The first is Issei, and these are the Japanese of the first generation who came to the United States starting in the late 1800s. With time, these Issei had families, and these children are the second generation, or Nisei, by birthright American citizens. There's a special group of the second generation called Kibe, who are also citizens by birthright, but were sent back to Japan for either school or work. All of them, however, became inmates in the context of the Japanese American experience. Some of us think that the anti-Japanese fervor happened just at the beginning of World War II. However, it had been going on for decades. Following on the 2 decades following the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, as seen on the left. In 1906, there was the Gentleman's Agreement, which said that basically we don't want to have more immigration of especially Japanese, but it also included Koreans. In 1907, there was a report saying that 1907 was a banner year. There was an influx of so many Japanese, they're pouring into the country. And in 1913, there was the California Alien Land Law, seen on the right-hand side of the screen, which was targeted mostly against the Japanese, but also included Indians, Chinese, and Korean farmers. And in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act prohibited any Asian immigration. The culmination of this anti-Japanese sentiment was December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and this precipitated the entry of the United States into World War II. What happened as a result of this bombing? There was an immediate roundup within hours, days, and weeks of leaders in the Japanese community. And a leader could be a Buddhist priest, someone who taught Japanese languages, or had classes in martial arts. I show this suitcase to symbolize two things. The first symbolism is that this belonged to a Mr. Iwasaki in Southern California. He was a leader in the community, and he packed a suitcase and left it by the door as he feared he would be taken away by the FBI and wanted to be ready. Every morning, his daughter would go to the door and peek to see if that bag was still there. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 that stated that all persons of Japanese ancestry had to be, quote, evacuated, that is, removed from the west coast of the United States for their protection. By April 1st, there were notices, as seen on the left, in all Japanese American communities for removal within a few weeks to detention centers, euphemistically called assembly centers, often horse racing tracks or fairgrounds where they were housed in the stalls themselves. Homes, businesses, farms had to be sold quickly, pets were abandoned. Photo documentation was coordinated by the US government, and these two pictures on the right were taken by the great photographer Dorothea Lange, and many of whose photos were impounded by the US government during the war. And the other symbolism of this suitcase is, if you read any interviews, you listen to them, people said the same thing. We could take only what we could carry. By the end of April 1942, the government started to move 120,000 people from the West Coast. 10 concentration camps were built in remote areas of the country: Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, 2 in Arkansas, 2 in Arizona, and actually 2 in California, despite being in the exclusion zone. These were Tule Lake and Manzanar, which I will discuss in detail in this presentation. People were moved in trains and buses, told to keep the shades down. They were accompanied by soldiers. 2/3 of them were American citizens. 1/3 of them were children. Let's move into the issue of the power dynamics under the War Relocation Authority. These camps held anywhere from 8 to 18,000 people. They were poorly insulated barracks organized into blocks. Barracks had no plumbing, meaning communal laundry, bathing, toiletry, meals were in separate buildings. And in this picture in the back, you can see the gardens alongside the barracks. They were run by white administrators who had their own section of the camp with better housing. These administrators set up work schemes with a low pay of $12 to $19 a month, with skilled professionals getting the top pay. But it was still less than soldiers, and these same wages were applied to teens and adults. They were set to be run like a typical, quote, American town, with community councils, but the power dynamics were such that only American citizens could apply, which meant basically the younger Nisei, who basically started to usurp the power of their parents. They were also given a false sense of control, as ultimately the WR administrator had veto power. In the upper right-hand corner is a picture of one of the community councils in action in a photo taken by the photographer Ansel Adams. One issue that was very controversial was the issue of issuance of a loyalty questionnaire, and questions 27 and 28 about the willingness of men to serve in the armed forces were ever ordered, and also to swear unqualified allegiance and forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. And this caused an enormous amount of controversy, which I'll discuss later on in this presentation. In terms of the production of food as planned by the War Relocation Authority, let's go back to the history of farming among the Japanese. Japanese immigration, as I stated earlier, started in the late 1880s after the Chinese were excluded by the Exclusion Act of 1882. However, work still needed to be done. The type of work that the Chinese were doing still needed to be done. The Japanese started to come in. And by 1908, the Japanese dominated agriculture. In 1940, with 2% of the land, they cultivated 30% of the food crops. This engendered jealousy among the white farmers. The Issei, as non-citizens, because of the alien land law, could not own land. They used American citizen children, white friends, and associations to obtain access. These were not big farms. For example, in the upper left-hand corner, you see a typical farm, strawberries, it was the crop here, and this strawberry growing was basically controlled by the Japanese. In the inset to the upper left-hand photo, you see a soldier who was sent home on furlough to help his mother, who was a strawberry grower, to get ready to be detained. And this happened in Florin, California, just outside of Sacramento. Tule Lake was deemed to be, from the beginning, an agricultural project. The land was fertile, and in August of 1942, just a couple of months after the camps opened, crops had been planted, and the extensive crucial knowledge of the farmers was utilized. Those who had worked to run successful farms were relegated to field labor of $16 a month, as seen in the lower left-hand corner. The camps were designed to be self-sufficient in growing their own food, and Tule Lake was deliberately set up to sell to other camps and also on the open market. Ironically, incarcerees were used to rescue potato and beet crops in other states as white farmers were joining the war effort as soldiers. The pay was better, but they had to guarantee that family members left behind were cared for. Resentment and rebellion ensued. The food was inadequate, the clothing was inadequate, as well as the equipment, and the final straw was an accident where a young inmate was killed. The inmates went on strike, thinking they had the upper hand because of crops that needed to be harvested. However, they were outwitted by the WWII director of Tule Lake, who brought in inmates from other camps, paying them $1 an hour when the Tule Lake workers were getting $18 a month. Martial law was declared in November of 1943, and the army was brought in. 200 inmates were arrested and put into a jail within the camp. Pictured here, there was also another stockade on the premises. Food quality was even poorer than for the regular incarcerees. And here is an excerpt from a diary from Mr. Inoue, who talked about his Thanksgiving meal. He kept a record of every single meal he ate during the whole time he was in this prison. So on Thanksgiving Day, he had started with 2 pieces of bread and coffee. Lunch had more starch, and by dinner was having rice, cabbage mixed with weenies and carrots. At New Year's Day, 1944, the 199 men went on a hunger strike for 7 days. The second power dynamic was the erosion of family life. Originally, the men had come to the United States with the idea of making money and returning to Japan, basically being a sojourner. By 1908, the men were allowed to bring in women as picture brides. As we can see in the upper left-hand corner, a group of them waiting to land, to land in the United States. These women, some of whom had been tricked, being told that they were very young, handsome men who were prosperous farmers or merchants, but they also ended up toiling in the fields with their husbands. With time, children were born, the fathers ruled the home, and their word was law. Sons had precedence over daughters, and the wife came last. For parents, it was kodomo no tameni, for the sake of the children. But the dynamic between parents and children begins to shift even before the incarceration. As American citizens, children can own the land. They can serve as translators for the parents. They become Americanized. The incarceration, as exemplified here in the lower right-hand corner with the family of the Mochidas, labeled with numbered tags, gets ready to be transported to a detention center. Again, looking at the bags on the ground with only what they could carry. In terms of the production and consumption of food, as mentioned, food was taken in mess halls as there was no plumbing or stoves in the barracks, although some improvised with forbidden hot plates or used the potbelly stove that was the only source of heat in the room. Each block's mess hall served around 300 people. The activity became institutionalized. Women who traditionally prepared meals were mostly relegated to be servers and dishwashers. Men, many of whom had never cooked, became the chefs. Following the WRA controlled menu of ration food set at 45 cents per day per person, although with time and the production of crops and meat, the amount sometimes decreased. In one unanticipated way, women became, quote, liberated, unquote, from some of their traditional roles and had a bit more leisure time or could work for the small amount of money allocated to jobs. Lines were long, food often not palatable. A WR official talked about edible offal, OFFAL, which was called by inmates as awful edibles. Between meals, these mess halls were used for other activities, dances, special events, films, church services, and during the fall and winter of 1943, discussions and debates on the loyalty questionnaires. Here are some typical scenes. On the upper left-hand corner, the concept of the family meal broke down. You can see these teenagers and men eating with their friends. Same thing in the lower left-hand corner, mother with the children, the men in the background eating by themselves. Conditions were crowded. Artists also painted scenes of camp life. This is one by Mr. Henry Sugimoto. And the point here is that you see some of the things you see in the photographs, but also if you can note the signs in the back. No second helpings, and milk only for children and the sick. Food was rationed as it was for all of the United States. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a coupon, ration coupon of one of the inmates. On the big photo on the right is my uncle, who's third in the back from the left, with his kitchen crew. And I show this picture because the sign in the back notes that because of rationing, go eat at your own hall. But people would actually go from hall to mess hall in order to eat again. And my uncle noted that there were some cooks that were better than others, and so they made a beeline for those mess halls. And on an ironic note, the WRA was asking for volunteers to rescue the beet crop, the source of sugar outside the camp. Finally, we discussed the tensions among the inmates. The loyalty oath that I showed engendered different reactions among different people. There were those in the upper left-hand corner who volunteered to fight for the United States despite being incarcerated, despite their families remaining incarcerated. Later on, the draft happened. These men became part of a military intelligence service, the MIS, and served as translators, or became part of the segregated unit of Japanese Americans and Japanese Hawaiians, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the 100th Infantry Battalion that fought in some of the fiercest battles in Europe and was the most decorated unit of its size during the war. The painting, again by Mr. Sugimoto, shows the painful scene of parents seeing their son go to war. And it shows some of the iconic elements of the camp: the mess hall, the WWII truck, the desolate barracks. Some actually became draft resistors, notably the Hard Mountain, Wyoming trial of 63 so-called no-no boys for answering the negative to the two key questions of the loyalty oath, which could be answered yes, 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 no, no, yes, or no, no. They were all convicted with 3 years of imprisonment. Later, President Truman pardoned all draft resistors, including these men. Some people were very pro-Japan and had been moved to Tule Lake Segregation Center in the middle of the war. They demonstrated while in camp and elected to go back to Japan. This last slide shows some of the most egregious issues regarding food and power in the camp. In the top left are the JACL, Japanese American Citizen League, hyper-patriots, pro-American, some even informants on others. They were favorites of the WRA. They were the Nisei. They were younger. They spoke English. And of course, given the name of the organization, they were citizens. In the lower left were the primarily Japanese-speaking Issei and Kibe, who made up most of the kitchen staff in the camps. These were low prestige jobs and little power with the WRA. The two groups clashed throughout the summer of 1942, and when the JACLers lost an election to the Issei and Kibe faction, the WRA actually intervened and said that the WRA rules state that only American citizens could hold elective office and commissioned an all-Nisei group to draft charter rules. In the middle is a picture of Mr. Harry Ueno, a Kibe cook's assistant, who organized in Manzanar a mess hall workers union of 1,500 workers of the 4,000 workers total in the camp to bring grievances to the WRA. He had noted a lack of sugar in the incarcerees' mess halls while being plentiful in the staff dining halls. After his own investigation, he documented a 20,000-pound shortage. He accused the assistant administrator of taking sacks of sugar out of the camp in the trunk of his car, and this was witnessed by the Japanese American military police in the camp. And he also accused him of selling meat, fruit, and cookies meant for children. Tensions arose, not helped by the favoring of the pro-American group by the WA authorities. And on the first anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a JACL leader was beaten, a riot broke out, resulting in 2 people being killed and 9 others injured. In the upper right, you can see the Minidoka Irrigator, the newspaper of the Minidoka camp, which said 1 had been killed, 9 had been hurt in Manzanar. And in doing the research and looking for the same information in the Manzanar paper, I found out that the information had been censored. Ueno and the others were accused of the beating, arrested, and sent to isolation prison camps. So to summarize, I've shared the power dynamics vis-a-vis food between the WRA and the incarcerees, the change in the power structure within the family, and the tension between the pro-American Japanese and the more traditional group, partly generational, partly exacerbated by the WRA, and damaging to the point of deaths and additional restrictions and hardships. I dedicate this presentation to family and friends and all Japanese Americans who suffered this injustice. And we recognize this history every February 19th as a day of remembrance to emphasize that never again is now, which is needed more than ever today. Thank you very much.
Hey, hello everyone. So welcome. My name is Haruka Raudabush. I am on the steering committee of this year's Tadaima program, and I am also the senior programs manager at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, based in San Francisco's Japantown. We're so glad to have you with us today for our Q&A for today's session. And so you just watched the presentation by Dr. Paula Fujiwara, and the presentation is based on her paper entitled Food Production, Consumption, and Resistance Among Japanese Americans Incarcerated by the U.S. Government During World War II. And the paper itself was selected for presentation at the 2019 Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. And the theme of the symposium in 2019 was Food and Power. So a little bit more about Paula. Paula is an internationally known physician specializing in tuberculosis and public health. And she is, besides myself, another member of the Tadaima organizing committee this year. And she is also a member of the Tule Lake Pilgrimage Committee as well. And Dr. Fujiwara is also currently doing research on a project for 50objects.org on the late Dr. Yoshie Togasaki, who was a Nisei physician at Manzanar who set up a public health program at the camp. So with that, I want to get into the Q&A for today's session. And we'll start off by asking Dr. Fujiwara, could you just give us a little bit more background about yourself and how you got connected to this topic of food production in the camps? Being someone who runs programs, culinary programs in the community at the Japanese Community Center, I know that we have a very rich history and legacy in our community of agricultural production. And so it's always interesting for me to see how folks, even a couple generations removed from their roots in agriculture might connect with that history.
Well, thank you, Haruka. And I have to say that you kind of said it all. But the point is about the food history is that I'm interested in food history per se. And so the topic of this, the presentation that I just made came by accident because I was attending the Oxford Symposium and they said, next year's theme is going to be food and power. And I said, my light bulb went off and I said, okay, this is my opportunity to talk about our history. So that's the reason. Basically, in food, I'm interested in the Victorian and Edwardian area and etiquette books. So this has nothing to do with my usual interest in food.
Let's see. So one of the things that really struck me when hearing your presentation, but also when I first learned about the actual food production that went on in the camp, is just the scale of it. I was, completely unaware, and I think one of the first experiences I had where I came, or was exposed to this aspect of our camp history was when I went to the Japanese American Museum in San Jose, and they had an exhibit, and they talked about the production at Gila River in particular. But one of the things that came to mind that I wondered about the food production in the camps is how that was all planned out, right? Was that something that was completely set by the military, or how did they choose what crops were grown at the camps? And was a lot of it dependent on like the expertise and the knowledge and the ingenuity of the JA farmers?
Well, thank you, Haruka. That's a complex question. Several elements to it. I just found out that the first administrators of the WRA were actually from the United States Department of Agriculture. So from the very beginning, the idea was that the camps were going to be self-contained. They were supposed to produce their own food. So that was why that was set up. Now, in terms of where the camps were held, some of them were in very fertile land, some of them not so fertile. For example, Tule Lake was considered an agricultural project from the beginning. So that's it. And then you also mentioned Gila River and the San Jose Museum. That was the biggest producer of food in the of all of the camps. So the issue was self production, selling if you could. Some of it was on the parallel market, and so that's the history of the food being developed, food production being developed in the camps.
Great. Thanks, Paula. So at this point, I do want to remind folks in the audience who are watching us live also that you can answer your questions for Dr. Fujiwara in the comments as well, and we'll do our best to incorporate them into the Q&A. So please do answer your questions here for us. So I do have another question to sort of follow up with sort of the nature of the food that was available to incarcerees in the camps. One of our other Tadaima presenters, yes, Koji Lao Ozawa, he has presented a couple times that I've seen on the different archaeological digs that he's been working on at Manzanar and also at Gila River. But one of the things that he showed that they had dug up in his studies were some contraband glass bottles that held shoyu, soy sauce, that I guess apparently some of the incarcerees had smuggled in to the camps because they didn't have the brand of shoyu that they preferred at the camp while they were, eating out of the mess hall there. So that kind of leads to the question for me, what sort of Japanese food ingredients might have been accessible to folks during their incarceration, if any?
Actually, Haruka, there was a lot of Japanese food, and it
Hmm.
was actually produced by the inmates themselves. For example, there was an excellent article that was written by Professor Carl Lilquist, and it's called from a journal called Agricultural History, and he documented that there were 61 varieties of food, but many of them were Japanese produce. For example, the Japanese cucumber, mizuna. He actually called it goma for sesame seed, gobo, habucha, kabucha, and nappa. All those things were actually available, and also soybeans. That was important because you could make your own tofu. You can start to make your ingredients there. So it's interesting that this researcher found this hidden bottles of shoyu. But another thing that was produced that was not supposed to be produced was sake. And
Ah,
that was definitely contraband. And I remember my uncle telling me, he says, "Oh yes, my sister, she got married in the camp. We had a reception, and there was actually sake there." So that was it. And then in Minidoka, they were actually doing some pickling of food, but
hmm.
what happened was they stopped it when they found out that sake was being produced.
Oh, let's see. That's so fascinating. I should have assumed that someone would have figured out how to brew some sake while they were incarcerated, but of course, it's fascinating to hear about. Um, Another question that I had, I think, kind of goes back to the state of Japanese American agriculture pre-war. You had mentioned that there was a lot of early success that had been sort of built up by Japanese American farmers early on, and we certainly had a few notable, like I guess, kings of their industries that had emerged. But do we know? Are there any studies that show what's percentage of the overall labor force was represented by Japanese American laborers?
Yes. So you mentioned the kings, and there are two kings that are recognized. One is George Shima, who was considered to be the potato king, and that was
Mhm.
early on, even before the Asian Exclusion, the Land Exclusion Act, Alien Land Law. And the other one was Mr. Koda, who's famous for his Kokuho Rose rice that certainly I grew up with. The issue of how many agricultural workers? Remember, there were only about 120,000 Japanese in the country at that time,
Mhm.
and 36,000 of them were actually involved in agriculture. Now remember
Wow.
that the Japanese only controlled 2% of the land, but they produce, as I said in my talk, about 30% of the crops. Now, okay, 36,000 seems a lot of people, but we have to remember that the agricultural system in that country around that same time was 36 million farmers. So what we're talking about is 0.1% of the farming people were actually Japanese. I
Hmm.
think there's a question I can see.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can
Oh
read
yeah,
that out loud.
okay.
So we have a question from Lily in the audience. So she asks, she says, "Hi, Paula. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that children were Americanized. So how did this affect family dynamics and their eating customs prior to the camps?"
Well, thank you, Lily. If you're talking about prior to the camps, I think it was a very hierarchical issue in the family. Families ate together. And even when they're assuming there was enough food, then people could get the food. But if there wasn't, the choicest things would go to the father. And then maybe the children, and last of all, the wife. So the dynamic before the war was to have family-centric meals, which, as I pointed out in this talk, became not so common during the war.
That's great. So I think I have a related question to that then, and that you mentioned in your presentation that so the dynamics of the nuclear family sort of suffered a little bit because in the camps people were having fewer meals together as family units, and were eating in the mess halls more like with their peer groups and with their friends. But um, do you think that there were sort of long-lasting effects that were like even generational that resulted from sort of that breakdown in family structure through the mealtime?
That's a hard question to answer because I don't have all the data. I can only go from some of my own personal experience. Obviously, in my family, we all ate together, and
Mm-hmm.
in my family, it was like if my mother said we're having this meal, this is what we're having. You don't have a choice. I've noticed that today it seems like kids have more of a choice about what they want to eat. But the other thing is, if we think about the Japanese American experience afterwards, there are a lot of like food festivals. There are a lot of times, like for example, food cookbook community cookbooks. So this
Mm-hmm.
whole issue of food is still very, I think, important. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, a Japanese Presbyterian church, and the theme of the church is called food, faith, and fellowship. So
Mm-hmm.
food is still an important part, and we'd have a festival festival every year where food was cooked, and our the church is very famous for its teriyaki sauce with the secret sauce, and
Mm-hmm.
and no one can have the recipe, although it is still sold. So in terms of the larger question of what happened in terms of the dynamics within the family around food, I don't know the answer. I don't know if there's something in your own family that would address this issue.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it looks like we have a question from Ken in the audience. So Ken says, "Those are the Puyallup Assembly Center slash Minidoka uh, camp. I remember eating beef tongue. So the beef tongue actually had the taste bud still intact. So were the inmates at the camps eating surplus byproducts as part of what was on offer to them?"
Yes, I mentioned that comment about the edible offal, OFFAL, versus the offal edibles, and I think that when you read any account, I've never heard anyone say the food was wonderful. No, it was not good at all, and there was a lot of stuff about they talked about weenies, green food. The meat had turned green. There was even I read something about fish. Fish was even available, but there
Hmm.
were maggots in it.
Oh.
Things like that. So Yes, they did have the supply issue. The other thing is that in the first one, at the detention centers, I think the food was really bad because the authorities didn't understand the Japanese palate, the need for rice, et cetera, and putting jello on rice or peaches on those kinds of things, and seeing rice as a sweet issue versus a not our basic food. So that was something that, so yes, the authorities did put the have byproducts put in. And also the other thing is that there were rumors that the people in the camps were getting steaks and everything like that. No, that was not true. And every month the camp authorities had to send to Washington, D.C. their proposed menu for the following month to get it approved and to make sure it stayed within the allocation of 45 cents per day per person.
Yeah, and that also brings to mind for me some recollections and anecdotes from incarcerees talking about having developed certain aversions to foods because of having to eat them in the camps as well. So I'm sure some of you out there have family members that have similar stories. All right, but we have another question. This one is from Sylvia. How did the food that was produced get allocated? Was it possible for incarcerees to eat the produce they were producing? Or why only 45 cents per day per person?
Well, thank you, Sylvia, for the question. If you could keep, if Kimiko, if you could keep it up, it's because there are three parts of it. Yeah. So how did the food get allocated is an important question. The camps were made to be self-sufficient, but those that made extra food were able to ship it around to the other camps and also on the open market. And sometimes it was actually on the parallel market, meaning they weren't supposed to do that because they had promised the farmers in the area they wouldn't do it, but that would happen. So yes, the whole idea was for the incarcerees to eat the produce and other foods that they were producing. The other question is why 45 cents per day per person? This was a requirement from the War Relocation Authority, and this amount was actually supposed to be less than what a soldier got. So a soldier got 50 cents. I think it was 50 cents a day rather than 45 cents a day per person. So this had to be under that, just as the pay scale for the work had to be under what a GI got. So that's why it was 45 cents. However, there was some cheating going on, and they got to as low as maybe 31 cents per day per person. So there were complaints about that.
Let's see. We have a question from Kimiko. And so her question is, how nutritious was the food in the camps? Were there any lasting health effects that those who were small children or babies in the camp experienced as a result of the nutrition there?
Well, as I've read some accounts, is that no one starved. Again, Kimiko, if you could leave the question up, that would be helpful. So no one starved. So was it nutritious? I've seen there are two reports. There's a report from one nutritionist who is a white nutritionist who was assigned to Gila River, who did a report on the food and was teaching some of the women how to cook. I have never been able to locate this report, and I'm still looking for it. I know she produced a cookbook after the war. But the other thing, I was very privileged. In August, when I went to Heart Mountain for my own personal pilgrimage, I was shown a dietitian's report. And this report looked at all of the blocks and did an analysis of the food. So the issue was that there was not as nutritious as it could have been. The other issue is children. And that was an issue because babies, there was not enough milk. So, and if you also had special needs, if you were diabetic or you had high blood pressure or whatever like that, they were special diets, but sometimes they were not able to be provided. So yes, they did try to prioritize the milk for the children, but sometimes there just wasn't enough.
Let's see. It looks like we have an additional question from Michelle. And Michelle's question is, can you draw any parallels between food production and consumption in the camps with other incarcerated populations?
This is an excellent question, because if you let's think about it this way. These camps were prisons, and there's a whole history in America of using prisons to actually provide their own food. If you think of, there's a prison in Louisiana called Angola, one of the most difficult prisons in the world. Another one, Parchman in Mississippi. These are prison camps, and the whole idea is that inmates have to provide their own food. So yes, this absolutely has a relationship to other incarcerated populations around the country, and it still goes. It today, I don't know if what's going on around that, but certainly historically, going back to the Civil War, using prisoners to provide their own food.
Right. So certainly if folks have any additional questions for Dr. Fujiwara, please enter them in the comments and we'll see if we can answer them for you. If not, I do have a question from myself, and that is, following having done this research and your paper for the symposium, are there other aspects of food production in the camps that the paper didn't address that you still would like to do further research on?
I am so interested now in what can be done on this. I'd like to look more into the nutritional status, especially since I got the information from the dietitians and dietitians report in Heart Mountain. So I am interested, but the field is so vast, and then I'm a person that kind of goes down a rabbit hole. So I see something and I go, oh, that'll look interesting. And so maybe it has nothing to do with food, but I want to report on it anyway. So right now, as you said in my introduction, I'm writing something on Dr. Togasaki, who's a public health physician, and I'm interested in her as a public health person like myself. I think it's interesting, like, what did she have to do in order to set up the systems to make food palatable, et cetera?
Great. Well, looks like we have a couple more questions that have come in. So next question is from Sylvia, and Sylvia asks, how did the government get permission to use these camps to turn swampland into arable land with the work of the successful Japanese American farmers?
Yes, that's also an important question, because you have to think about where these camps were, right? They were away from the West Coast, although you have Manzanar and Tule Lake within the restriction zone. Gila River and Poston were actually on Native American land, so that was the purview of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The two of them were on private lands, and the Bureau of Reclamation, I think, did Minidoka, Tule Lake, and Heart Mountain. So they and certainly Heart Mountain and Heart Mountain and Minidoka were not being farmed before. Some of the others, like in Topaz, there was farming going on. Now, you talk about the concept of a successful Japanese American farmer. Now, why were they successful? They actually brought techniques that had not been used by the white farmers, and this had to do with like making hot houses, mini houses, or learning how to do more. It's much more intensive farming. And the other hidden agenda, maybe it wasn't so hidden, but it was a hidden agenda, was that after the war, what was supposed to happen is that the Bureau of Land, it wasn't called Bureau of Land Management, it had another name, but they were going to give this land to the white farmers. And that is exactly what happened. The land was prepared, and also the land in Gila River and Poston was returned back to the Native Americans, and they continued to do the farming. So they give them over, and they actually auctioned off the barracks, and they made these farms for the local farmers. However, the Japanese people were not included, although there's one exception that I know about in Arkansas, where there is a Japanese American farmer. I don't know if he's still alive. I think his last name was Wada, and he was one of the two or three families that stayed after the war in Arkansas and continued the farming.
Right. It looks like we have another question from Kimiko now. And this is asking, didn't the food produced in the various campsites also feed the local communities surrounding the camps?
I don't know the exact answer to that question. There was a lot of, there were some people who were opposed to having, there was concern. There's concern among the local farmers that they were going, that they were going to be in competition with the Japanese farmers. So I'm not sure if they were actually going to actually feed the local communities. That I really don't know. However, I want to say something about during the war, as I mentioned in my talk, the white farmers in a lot of places just went away to go to war. So what happened was that the crops were rotting, and so the government had a system, these work farms, sending people, the sugar corporations, the beet sugar corporations, said, please send people. And the reason why many people went, especially the men, was that the pay was 10 times higher. Remember, these were people were getting maybe $16 a month. They were going to get about $135 per month, which was the prevailing wage at the time when they went to these places. So they could go, and many went, but they had to make sure that the people that were left behind, their families, were being cared for.
So we had a question from Ken now about, I guess, the scarcity of ingredients in camps. So his question was, were actual eggs also rare and valued, maybe on par with sugar?
I don't know about how rare and valued were, however, but we have to remember that within the camps, there was also not just crop production, but there were they grew, no, not grew, they raised cattle, they raised chickens, and they raised hogs. So there was meat that was actually being produced. So I'm assuming with the chickens they're going to have eggs. So I don't know how rare it was, but certainly they were available. And I was reading about, I think it was Minidoka, where the hogs, they fed the hogs all the waste from the food that was left over by the humans. So that's how the hogs were actually fed. But the egg question, there are eggs. I just don't know how rare and valuable they were.
Okay. Well, I have another question for myself. So for the camps that were, intentionally like large-scale agricultural production sites, I guess we know about sort of the large volumes of production that was coming out of those camps. But for other sites, was there smaller scale like subsistence farming, like maybe on the scale of like Liberty Gardens, that was happening amongst the blocks of incarcerees?
Yes, yeah. This is something that's always puzzled me because there are pictures of the camps where you see, I think I even showed one in my talk where you see a small garden off to the side. So within the camps themselves, people were growing their own food. But what was puzzling to me was that since they had to go eat in the mess hall, they didn't have the capacity, the usual capacity to just prepare their own food. Like, did they just send it to the mess hall, or what did they do with it? I didn't understand. But yes, there were victory gardens within the camps themselves, grown by the people. Absolutely.
And likewise, for any surplus crops, was there any sort of like open market within the camps, like a farmer's market type of setup?
I have not read that. What I do know is that there was a marketing between the camps for the biggest producers of food were Gila River and Tule Lake. And this researcher who wrote this, as I said, this brilliant paper that I mentioned already, he shows a map of how food was being moved from camp to camp. So there seemed to be like an internal system that was serving the camps, but also went on out into the open market. So both things were going on. The one of the two places that had cattle was Topaz, and there was grazing land around there, and the other one I can't, and Gila River, I think. Again, not quite sure about the second one, but so there was this internal within the camp system moving produce around. If you notice that most of the camps, I noticed this when I did my pilgrimage to Minidoka and Heart Mountain. They tried to put them in Gila River too. They tried to put them in places where they had railroad stations, so they could ship easily.
Interesting. All right. So at this point, do we have any other questions from the audience? No? Okay. Well, seeing no further questions, Dr. Fujiwara, do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to impart with us today?
Yeah, food is memory. And I think that of all of the aspects of remembering about the camps, I think the issue of food really sticks with us. It's we have to eat 3 times a day. So I noticed that when we talk to other JAs, they're always, they talk about the food, what they didn't like in the camps, but also the foods that we still treasure from our history. So I think that's important. I noticed that my mother just passed away in December, and before I never cooked Japanese food. I cooked, Italian and Chinese and everything else. But after she passed away, I started to cook Japanese food because it was a way of, remembering her. And I have to say, kind of tastes like mom's. So
That's wonderful. It looks like we do have one last question. If we can take a moment to answer that. So Sylvia asks, to what degree was the conflict between the resistors and the incarcerees evident as far as actual fighting?
I can't tell you the amount, but certainly there's a lot of tension, especially in, well, you saw what happened in Manzanar. But the other thing is that what happened in the segregation center when Tule Lake became a segregation center in the middle of the war, and the tensions between the inmates. And I was just reading. My father was a renunciant, and I was just going through the records of Wayne Collins the other day, and looking, and people were saying, I didn't want to give up, my citizenship. But what happened was I was being pressured by these people that were really pro Japan. So I got all confused, and I just decided to renounce. So there are stories like that. So in terms of actual fighting, I'm sure it existed, but there was conflict, and even until pretty recently, the people that were in Tule Lake that were the renunciants, the no people, there were times when they were shunned. So this is a sad history, and I think it was only in Salt Lake City's JCL meeting in 2019 where there was some forgiveness of the resistors.
Mhm. Right. Well, thank you, Paula. I think with that, then we can bring today's program to a close. We really appreciate your expertise that you shared with us and all the insights from your research for your paper. And certainly, I learned so much more about aspects of our food production and our legacy of agriculture in our community. So, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope the rest of you also learned a lot and continue to check out our other Tadaima programs today. So if you'd like to see the full schedule, we still have a couple more weeks of programs. If you go to www.jampilgrimages/Tadaima2021. So again, on behalf of the Tadaima Organizing Committee, thanks for being with us today and take care.
Thank you, Haruka.